Thank you, everybody. I'm so happy to be here and also to cooperate with the EuroMed Network for Human Rights. And I don't know if you can see my screen already.
We can indeed, yes.
Very good. First of all, I want to acknowledge the report writer, my colleague Francesca Asmar, who unfortunately left Oxfam, but she would have been the perfect person to present it. She worked very hard on it, and the whole idea of the report was to basically highlight the voices of women in the region. We were brainstorming about what we want to have as a feminist response from the MENA region. And we played with many ideas together, and then we thought, okay, there is lots of work, lots of talk about the increase of GBV, the physical violence. We know there is lots of work about how women are overburdened with the care work. We know there is lack of economic opportunities. Women have been kicked out of their jobs, etc. One of the issues that wasn't really covered was the because of the coronavirus and because of the pandemic, we actually had to use more the digital space. And more and more young women, women in general, were using the digital space, including our partners, our women human rights activists who are active in the region. They turn to the digital forums and digital space not only to provide services, but also to reach out for their networks. And within that space, they were first, there was two sides to the coin. That's why Francesca chose to call this discussion paper. I want to call it discussion paper really more than a research, because she used the claiming and reclaiming the digital space, and she looked at it as a space of activism, not only as a space of victimization. While we are aware, of course, that it is a space of victimization for many women who are harassed, who are violated, who are bullied, who there are all different forms of violence against them are happening, and we know that the digital space is actually mirroring the physical space, where in the MENA region it's a patriarchal society with lots of with women's rights are pushed to the back, and especially during the pandemic and all the other things that I talked about of the like how this patriarchal society manifested itself within the pandemic. So to do that, she did an extensive literature review for online and outline and digital safety practices for young women and feminist activists from the MENA region. By then, we looked at different blogs, lots of challenges. There was an issue, maybe some of you are aware of, in Egypt, where women were accused of human trafficking for simply using the digital space, etc. So we looked into a wide range of available materials at that time. In addition, we have in MENA region, we have 10 offices where we have gender justice leads in these different offices, and they work directly with our partners on the ground. So we had consultation within our gender justice leads or colleagues. And then we had 6 semi-structured interviews. And since it wasn't really a fully fledged research, we wanted to go to women who had lived experiences and had some kind of actual experiences with the digital activism and harassment at the same time. So I want to confirm that this piece is really centering around the voices and experiences of women who contributed to this research. So we had women activists from Tunisia, Lebanon, OBT, and Iraq. What struck us when we were exploring this digital safety and digital space, that really the women activists were looking at the more and more at this space as a space of resistance and freedom, because usually women, especially in MENA, they are not visible in the public spaces. They don't always have the freedom to move, to go out, etc. So having digital space in the safety of your home is an opportunity. But at the same time, as I said, we were shocked of how much this space, which is really at the tip of your fingers, is not very safe at all. And therefore, the focus of the discussion was around three issues. There was the personal experiences of margins of freedom. There was the organizational experiences of how they used the digital world for their activism and service provision. And then there was let's say, the cross-country or a transnational type of engagement and activism. And you will see that we use the names for the quotations. We use the names of the women who told us or discussed this with us. So you will be able to recognize them. They are all feminist activists from the region. So one of the things that women told us clearly about that the digital world is an alternative world, because while there are so many restrictions on how you present yourself in public spaces, how you look, how you dress, what you say, how the way you behave, everything is mirrored. There is a similar mirroring on the digital space, but as soon as the things is out, it's out. So basically, for women liberation and ability to present themselves, there is no control. I will take an example of a young woman who uses YouTube for dancing, for example, and she expresses herself through dancing. And she's someone who really enjoys this. If this was done in a physical space, maybe she would be so much criticized. And while on the digital space, she is still criticized by some, but she's still also admired by many, and therefore she's known and widespread. Her experiences of her body and self-expression is much more free. While it's free, but it's not safe. And that's what really, one of the quotes that stopped us is what Lila Hassan from Iraq told us. The digital space is not a safe space, but it's a brave one. Because basically you can dare to do things that cannot be done in real world. And the digital space, at the same time, as I mentioned before, is yet another patriarchal space where all types of violence are practiced. And Hayat Mirshad from Lebanon told us about so many experiences of patriarchal behavior on the digital space, including naming and shaming, stopping people from expressing their opinion, women not being able to use their real identities, etc., etc. As an organizational tool for feminist change, the digital platforms were very helpful because, especially during the pandemic, it was a way that these platforms give women activists in general access to population. Sarah Ben Said told us we could reach out not only our usual constituencies, but we could also reach out to women who are very far away in the rural areas, or younger women who wouldn't come to a webinar or a training we are organizing, but we could reach out to them in their places. Digital spaces also at the same time, and you would see that we try to flip the coin every time. So that's what the claiming and reclaiming, because while this digital space is open and basically has no boundaries, basically a group of feminist activists in Lebanon, for example, that I joined, they provide advice and services to women who need help. Women don't need to be victims of violence against women, but anyone who needs help, they can inbox them and ask for help. And it goes from asking for a yoga teacher to a psychiatrist or someone who is who can help them in identifying a skin disease or something. But this group, while it's based in a small town in Lebanon, it receives questions and inquiries from all over the Arab world, because it's there, and therefore we can help. And in many cases, the moderator reached out to me, do you know someone who can help this woman in Gaza, for example? So it's open, boundary without boundaries, but at the same time, it can open also for mass attacks. And we were told many stories where, for example, if a woman was killed or harassed, how this becomes like a public shaming campaign to her and to her family. And there are so many examples of this happening in the MENA region at the moment. Also, it's not easy because well, this is another area of discussion and research, which I think we need to dig deeper on much more. There are the big companies, the big tech companies are engaging also in violence against women and in violating women's rights. There are surveillance, there are selling of information, there are tracking, there are collaboration with Israeli government, for example, in the case of the Palestinians. But at the same time, the same companies allow for a couple of women organizations to report, for example, certain violations. And in a recent case in Palestine, one of the organizations, our partner organizations, actually reported an abuse, a threat of rape, not a simple abuse, a threat of rape to Facebook, and the person was blocked, and then they used the evidence from the Facebook to go to the government and to the Palestinian Authority and had him being arrested because he threatened a journalist of being raped. So there are also these two sides of the story. So the online world, they provide, as I said, boundless opportunities for women, and also risks and threats around the tools that remain a challenge for many women. Finally, this is a space of resistance and solidarity, because feminist movements across the boundaries, they have a possibility which they didn't have before, to exchange ideas, to talk about common experiences, to basically to have to build unities. In the case of the Palestinians, there are Palestinian women in different entities, in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, in the Arabs or the Palestinians inside Israel. And without the digital space, they cannot meet, because there are so many checkpoints, there are so many restrictions of movements. So the digital space provides this opportunity of engaging. But at the same time, also the attacks are boundless. It is a tool in the hand of the oppressor. So people who can feel also victimized by the authorities, because they would dominate their data, and they dominate also the way they express their views. And therefore, many feminist activists across the MENA region were attacked because of what they represent and because of speaking openly about their ideas and views. To some degrees, like to some ultimate degrees, like in Iraq, where women were killed because of expressing their views or participating in demonstrations or protests. In Egypt, they were imprisoned because just of being themselves. So what the women think, what these activists thought about the digital spaces. I will just read what Shada Sheikh Youssef from Palestine said. The digital spaces are spaces that we fight and struggle to be in. And it's in the same way that we fight in the streets and in the cities and even in our homes. We want to be part of these spaces, to express ourselves and to make our voices heard in them. So it is a space of resistance. And Maya Ammar from Lebanon, she said, we will take over these spaces. So it's the spirit of resistance as well. While Sarah bin Said, she said, we cannot leave the digital spaces because of harassers and rapists. So the virtual spaces hold many risks, but rather than leaving these spaces, we need to remain active and keep working on making them become safer. And we need to hold on the digital space because it's a space for freedom. So this is like a strong positive note, which I want to make sure that it actually reaches out, because I saw other reports which highlight the violence, the harassment, the cases that are really showing the women as victims, but I just want to end with this slide, which says that no, it's a space for resistance as well. For a feminist vision, I think this is also open, and I would love to hear from the audience about their views about the recommendations. As a starting point, we thought of what can be done: raising awareness, providing training about digital safety and protective tools. Some women activists are doing this. For example, Shada in Palestine is doing this, facilitating and online and offline spaces of solidarity for activists and supporting them, advocating for protecting legal protection and reporting mechanisms. In many countries in MENA, there is not enough legal framework for these modern crimes. Extend the definition of violence and address social norms. Social norms which are in the physical space, they are hindering lots of women's rights, but there are also new social norms that are developing in the digital space. And basically, we need to be aware of them. Holding governments accountable to their obligation to protect women's rights, and therefore the legal frameworks need to be modernized to be able to understand the space of this or the typology, let's say, of these crimes. And holding big tech companies to account to support the feminist digital rights and the groups. So this is, I think, still a topic for lots of research. And as we said, we wanted this to be a discussion paper, just a starting discussion, and we would like to build more on it. Just 2 days ago, or actually yesterday, I was in a meeting with feminists from Jordan who were describing how younger women in particular, because of the digital divide, the gender digital divide, younger women, they don't have access to these digital platforms. And if they have, it's so risky, to the degree that a young woman was killed in Jordan because she opened a Facebook account. So on the one hand, this is liberating, but on the other hand, we need to understand or know how to stop for the digital space to mirror the patriarchal space of the physical world. So I want to stop here, but I hope really to hear from you, and also to know more about what you suggest for further research and discussions on this, and what can be done in to support both activists and the women in their different diversities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hadeel. There was a lot to take in there, and a lot of potential ways of action. I know Lucille has also been working on such ways. So Lucille Griffon from EuroMed, if you would like to go on now and elaborate on what Hadeel just presented.
Sure. Thank you very much, Maxence, and thank you so much, Hadeel, for the presentation. It was brilliantly done, and I also really very much like this, let's say, this side that you took in not only showing women as victims of violence online, but also as first and foremost actors of radical change. So yeah, that's, I find really, really interesting. So perhaps I'll just try to describe first a bit the research that we've been doing. So we tried to, just like Hadeel said, for us, it's the first work that we do on the matter. So it's much more of a mapping study, if I may say. It focuses on online gender-based violence and on 9 countries of the MENA region, namely Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, OPT, Syria, and Tunisia. And the study also includes Turkey, because it's one of the areas where we work on. I also want to acknowledge the fact that this report is the work of the product of months of research from Sabrina Iannazzone, who is a consultant and who worked for us on it. It is a qualitative research, and it is based on 12 semi-structured, in-depth interviews with feminist activists, member organizations from EuroMed Rights, from each of the 9 countries that were mentioned. So the report will be published in January. So for now, I can only disclose a few, let's say, tendencies. It's quite a long report, so in 15 minutes, I'll do my best to say as much as I can. Of course, it applies to 10 different countries, which are very different social political settings, histories. So yeah, this is also something to take into consideration. Perhaps first, to describe the phenomenon, we use the definition of the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, who describes online violence against women as any act of gender-based violence that is committed, assisted, or aggravated in part or fully by the use of ICT, such as mobile phones, smartphones, the internet, social media platforms, email, against a woman because she is a woman or that affects women disproportionately. I also want to reassess what Hadeel said. Indeed, the online world and the online violence that is going on in this world is not a new form of violence per se. Gender-based violence has to be understood as a continuum. And the violence that women face online, they face it in the same way and for the same causes, let's say, online as well. So that's something also to take into consideration. Concretely, the forms of violence that we see in the report and from discussions that we had with activists on the ground, you could delimit it in two categories. The first one would be violations of privacy, such as stalking, doxing, taking, sharing pictures, including intimate data. That's a very widespread form of violence. Then you would have the second most widespread, cyber harassment, including smear campaigns, defamation, cyberbullying, online sexual harassment, etc. And then you'd have other types such as online sexual exploitation, cybercrime, threats of physical violence, and hate speech. Again, I also think it's important to acknowledge the fact that, of course, there is violence happening online, but who does it target? Because not everyone has access to internet and technologies. And in that regard, I find the ILO published a report on the matter, and it said that the internet user penetration rates, are higher for men than for women in all regions of the world, with the largest gaps found in the Arab states. The gap is of 20%. Of course, the definition of the Arab states from the ILO does not cover all the countries that we looked at in our research, but it's already a good indication, I find. And they also find that the percentage of Arab women who access and use the internet is 36.9%, and compared to men, where it's at 46.2%. So it is not so surprising that it seems, according to, again, the interview we had with activists on the ground, that it seems to be young, educated, unmarried women and girls who seem to be more exposed to cyber violence, and particularly on social media. I think there should be more research on that, but what we could already start to, if there's one conclusion or at least correlation that we could build from there, is that well, they are the ones most likely to be victims of online gender-based violence because they are the ones who have, let's say, more access to it in the first place. So there is really a class, age, and gender divide in the digital world. Then I wanted to offer a bit of a positive side of online movement, but I think Hadeel and the report from Oxfam covers it already very well. So I will jump sadly straight to what we found out regarding the more negative sides of things. That is the violence faced by women online. So almost mechanically, there is a growing, increasing use of ICT in the region, and therefore almost at the same time and at the same speed, a growing phenomenon of online gender-based violence. Just a few figures for those who perhaps are not really aware of the, let's say, the importance of the issue. In Turkey, the feminist writer Nursihan Temur found in her report that 60% of women that she interviewed had already been victims of at least one form of online violence. And another one in Egypt, another recent study by Fatma Hassan evaluated the impact of cyber violence on Egyptian women, and it concluded that 41.6% of the participants experienced cyber violence in 2019, and 45.3% of them reported multiple times of exposure. So the issue is there, and it is real and quite appalling. Then, of course, women is not a monolithic group, of course. There are categories of women, intersecting identities that shape and can worsen the violence and the form that the violence can take online. That is the case for women human rights defenders, feminists, feminist organizations. It's the space where they can work, where their voices are the loudest, and the backlash is also sometimes almost as strong. They are victims of attacks on social media, attacks that are aimed to silence them, very basically. And the means to do that is often to target their personal lives, their morals, their appearance, etc. In authoritarian contexts such as Egypt, it has been reported that women human rights defenders are even seen as the weakest link in the movement, so they would tend to be targeted more in that sense. Very recently as well, to illustrate the issue of online gender-based violence against public women, let's say, in Jordan, there was the parliamentary election in November 2020. And CG, the organization CG, did a report on that, or a survey, shall I say, and they found that 32% of them, so women politicians who participated in the campaign, had experienced traditional and electronic attacks during the campaign, such as insults or bullying. And again, different categories of women, intersecting identities can worsen the violence. That was also the case during this campaign, where a politician woman who has a disability was the victim of a campaign, bullying campaign, very violent campaign on social media, because she ran for parliament. And then perhaps last, the National Union of Tunisian Journalists pointed out that they think that there are fewer physical attacks against women journalists and journalists in general, but they see more violence happening on the internet, on social networks particularly, and particularly against women. So then what we have found by talking to feminist organizations, and in particular the ones who provide services to survivors, is that women tend not to file complaints to the police. Understandably, at times they do not trust their institutions, they do not trust the legal framework in their countries. The complaints that they might make to IT intermediaries often fall short. There is no response, no assistance. So it results in them censoring themselves, reducing their time on social media or on the internet. They would react to the violence themselves. Let's say they would block their followers themselves, they would hide their profiles themselves, change email address, etc., etc. So there is really a high impunity and under-reporting of the phenomenon. And then where does the violence come from? According to activists in the region, from individuals, like in the offline sphere, shall I say, it's overwhelmingly men and the state. The state is also an actor of violence, but I think I'll go into that a bit later. Perhaps very briefly on the legal framework, what we found is that there is usually two ways that the online gender-based violence phenomenon could be tackled legally, either through the legal framework dedicated to violence against women or to eliminate violence against women, or via cybercrime laws. So legal framework on violence against women in the region. Well, first off, many countries or many states do not have a full-fledged legal framework that can protect women from all forms of violence. So there's already a limit there. Generally speaking, only Jordan, Lebanon, Tunisia, Morocco, and Turkey have standalone laws on the elimination of and protection from violence against women. And these, of course, besides the Tunisian one, perhaps are already being criticized by feminist organizations for their flaws. And then you would have the cybercrime laws. And that is something, these types of laws, we can see them in most of the countries we looked at. First of all, very briefly, they fail to take into consideration gender perspectives. They are always rather focused on issues of national security, terrorism. So they don't really protect women from all the forms of gender-based violence. Countries like Egypt, Palestine, Jordan, or Syria have extensively used these laws, or others like online laws against online hate speech to silence dissent under the guise of protection of national security and reduction of false news at times. And we see these social media laws being more and more popular, shall I say, or more and more implemented in the region. Recently, one was also adopted in Algeria in April 2020, and it's also being criticized by civil society and most particularly feminist organizations, as it basically ends up obstructing freedom of expression. So yes, the technology is, as we've seen, can be used by states to enact violence against women and LGBTI people as well. I think sadly the most infamous example would be the repression that followed the concert of Mashwa Leila in Egypt in 2017, where the government unleashed a wave of arbitrary arrests, torture of LGBTI people. And in this instance, and in many others, but this one is the most infamous, let's say, the technology was massively used to track and imprison people using gay dating apps such as Grindr, etc., to gather evidence. Sarah Hegazi, we remember her, was jailed and tortured, charged with promoting sexual deviancy and debauchery. So I'd say, to conclude very briefly on the main takeaways of the report, would be that there is clearly a legal vacuum on matters of online gender-based violence, but already on matters of violence against women in general. And then the cybercrime laws, which are often or sometimes used to focus on particular issues linked to the ICT development, they are used to silence dissent, which further is used as a tool to violent women human rights defenders, as we've seen. There is indeed an issue of accountability from ITC providers. They are, in instances, and Hadeel mentioned it, complicit of state violence, and they do not react appropriately when violence is being reported to them. There is, of course, an issue beyond the violence, let's say, in that the violence faced obstructs freedom of movement and expression from women and LGBTI people, which we resort into self-censorship. Of course, there are brilliant movements out there who are indeed brave and continue being vocal, but this is also the case that there is self-censorship. And perhaps once again, feminist organizations as we see in the report, are doing an incredible job in doing the job that the state should be carrying. And that is also very clear. I wanted to end with a quote from Monira Mabouti, from the Marsat Nisa project coordinator in Tunisia. And she told us that the situation of violence against women in the cyberspace reflects the patriarchal culture prevailing in society, as well as the gap between laws and reality. Actually, it is not a matter of insufficient legislation, but laws must be activated and properly applied. That's it.
Thank you very much, Lucille, and thank you, Hadeel. So we'll open the floor to questions. If you have any questions, you can either put them in the raise your hand or use the Q&A option. And to start, I'll have a question myself, because we've heard about the different types of the different forms of violence and their source, which can be both coming from individuals. We know that some violence comes from state governments. So we've seen the example in Egypt with women using TikTok and being arrested. And I was wondering, on a practical level, what can activists do to avoid or to counteract these threats, both against individuals but also against the state? And second part of my question, is there something that can be done through ICT providers, through private platforms? They have a role to play, I believe. So I don't know, Hadeel, if you have some answer towards that, and then Lucille, maybe.
Yes, thank you. Good questions. For the first one, I think without solidarity and really building a stronger connected feminist movements across the world, not only in the MENA region, these attacks will continue. The only salvage for individual activists is really support from others, and making cases known and protested against, and really make sure that everybody is talking about them, and providing safeguarding basically for these activists. But and I want to say, yes, activists are more subjected to such attacks, but also regular, ordinary individual women with all their diversity are also being attacked. So if we get to know about these famous cases because the activist is well known or networked, we also need to pay attention and pay solidarity to these regular women in their day-to-day lives as well. And this is a responsibility for women rights organizations and for human rights organizations around the world. For the other question, yes, I think definitely big ICT companies have lots of responsibilities, and if you want, this is a wider cause. Let's say it's related to the way the internet is governed, and no more the internet is the profitable income for these ICT companies. It is a public good, and it's becoming a life necessity. And without having global governance for internet that is governed by ethics and human rights values, that prevents data extraction for making profit, and that provides possible ways of accountability to basically hold accountable anyone who misuses data and misuses information. Without having this on place, I'm afraid violations will continue, and it's not going to end very, very soon. So this is maybe a call for a more global. There are lots of work done in terms of global of internet governance, but actually building on this momentum and really to demand the same way we demand for other human rights, to have appropriate internet provision that is safe and that provides the public good for people around the world.
Okay, so a level playing field. And Lucille, would you have anything to add?
I 100% agree with what Hadeel said. And for the first question, indeed, global transnational solidarities and feminist solidarities are needed. And I think Hadeel said it very well. But perhaps I think somehow it's, again, this idea of the double coin. When you are a public figure, you tend to be more protected by other networks that are outside of your country. You tend to be more known. So it's somehow both a protection and also a vulnerability. And indeed, when you are not in this situation, or when you are not privileged, when you are from a marginalized community, the level of impunity against you is even stronger. So that's, I can recall in the report, that's also something that was part of the things that we should look into further, is the tendency from, I think it was in Egypt, of the state to target women and their online behaviors, especially when they are from lower social backgrounds. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, and more research should be done on that. And then on the ICT responsibility, yes, of course, I think as Hadeel said, many organizations are pushing for that, but engaging with these ICT providers, naming them and shaming what they do, it's a very classic method of civil society action, but it also works. Naming and shaming for their action. So that's one thing. And then perhaps at the more international level, yes, indeed, we need global governments that can rule these spaces, which are now a continuation of our public spaces. So the same rules should apply to them. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you to both of you. I'll take one last question. Is you both in Oxfam and at EuroMed, you met for these two reports that are being published or will be published. You met with victims of cyber violence. I wanted to ask you, because you talked to them, what are the consequences for these victims? And do you think they're currently, because we're talking about improving, building this platform to combat violence, do you think these victims are included enough in the solution? Are they part of building that? Hadeel, first, maybe if you have a...
Just to clarify that for Oxfam report, we didn't meet with the victims or survivors of violence because as I told you, it was supposed to be a discussion paper exploring the field. However, I have been in contact with the women shelters here in Palestine, and I know they are overwhelmed because they were not prepared to the amount of, to the number of women who come to the shelters because of cyber crimes or cyber threats. And one of the managers of the shelters told me, I didn't understand it. I didn't understand how this crime happens. How come these women become victimized in this way to the degree that their lives are threatened? Lots of it is about lack of awareness about, so you are sitting in your own home in the comfort of your room, and you don't realize that actually you are broadcasting data to the open world, because you think that you closed. It's a different perception of your boundaries. You close your room, but your internet is taking you all over the world. And this shift happened so quickly, and there is not enough awareness and enough training or education, even for younger and older people, about how to use it. So you can often see naive posts or naive photos because people thought that it's only a small group can see them. So in that sense, I think the survivors are not really consulted enough. Well, I don't think so far, at least from our perspective, our research wasn't really survival centered. But we are aware that in the future, any interventions need to be like this, need to be survival centers and centered and need to include their perceptions and their needs. We assume that lack of awareness is the reason, but at the same time, similar to any form of gender-based violence, where women, it happens in privacy, it happens in secrecy, women are very reluctant to report. They report only when it's too much or out of control, and the same is happening in the cyberspace. So I think there is a lot to learn about what can be done, how who needs to be educated about this, and what kind of interventions are needed. I'm also very concerned about the mental part of it, because as my colleague said, there's very small fracture who report this violence. I told you I was in a meeting with the Jordanian feminists, and there is a huge gap in the law which requires a minor to report the violence with their parents. And most of these women who are victimized, they are 16 or 14 or 15, and they have to basically be victimized another time when they inform their parents. They cannot go to report the case to the law, and nobody can help them. Therefore, it's double and triple types of oppression, because these younger women, first, they were not educated enough about using the digital spaces. Second, if they had an issue, they cannot inform anyone, including their parents or teachers. And if they inform them, they don't know how the police will react to it. So there are so many levels that requires interventions and support. It's very, well, it's still new, fairly new in the region to address these issues, and requires lots of work, in my opinion.
Thank you. Lucille, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, indeed. I completely, I think what's, with regards to the trauma that it creates in survivors, I think of course, I mean, we can see the same types of trauma that we would see in other forms of violence, such as physical violence. But perhaps what is more problematic with regards to this type of violence is that it's often not even considered as a violence. It's very much trivialized. Again, we have not talked directly with survivors, but we had interviews with organizations that are working with survivors. And that's really the tricky bit, is that you are facing some violence, but at the same time not being recognized as a survivor. So that's the added dimension of the online sphere. Another tricky thing, or appalling thing, shall I say? As Hadeel said, yeah, this thing of like being able to constantly being re-traumatized by the violence, say in cases of image-based abuse. So if someone takes pictures without your consent, intimate images, you will be re-victimized, and the trauma will be reenacted upon you each time it's shared. And on the internet, it can be shared multiple times. So that's very, very worrying side of it. And to the questions, are survivors being consulted? I mean, are service providers, feminist organizations being consulted in the first place? Not really. So from this point, I think we already know the answer. Not enough. Yeah.
Thank you, Lucille. Thank you, Hadeel. So still a lot of work basically to continue to do, and I guess both your studies will help the victims to get the words out and maybe fight against this.
Can I say something else?
Of course, go ahead.
Because this is a new forms of violence, many of even activists and well-intentioned people, they don't know how to deal with it. So we had to actually argue with some of our colleagues who wanted to publish the report by having some screenshots from the actual victimization, like swears or threats, and we said, no way, we are not going to do that. And they said, but this will be more interesting, more eye-catching, draw more attention. And we said, no way, we are not going to re-victimize the person. But in the same week almost, and as a women's rights organization who works on this issue, and they succeeded actually to bring to justice the person who threatened the journalist to be raped. And they were very effective, but they did this they announced their victory by republishing what was said to the journalist. And it was basically very horrifying, like someone threatening to rape you, for example. And then I phoned the director of this organization and said, but how come, I mean, thank you, you are successful in bringing this person to justice, but how come you are reposting his threats and you don't know how many times this is shared? And she said, no, but I want to educate others about, so if someone who sees this and they received similar threats, they can come and report. So I think, well, I have my views. I would never ever repost any threat of rape at all. I don't find anything justifies a threat of rape. But so that makes me think that women activists, even human rights activists, also need to be educated about how to deal with these issues. Understanding the psychological side of it, understanding that when you post something on the internet, basically it's sustainable. It will reproduce, it will recome, maybe 100 years later will come. All of this digital education is lacking also at the side of the human rights defenders, I would say. And that's something that we need to pay attention to.